project. And the next portion of the project is going to be the top and the door. We're going to build the top and the door of the project. So we're going to check against the plans, but we're also going to take some measurements here and see how big our things need to be. We're doing a 1/2 inch overlay. That means the door is going to overlay the face frame a 1/2 inch all the way around. So if I take my tape measure and pull this to my opening of my door, I'm at 14.5. So I need to add an inch on for my 1/2 inch overlay. So we're going to be at 15.5. That's how long my pieces need to be. And my door width should be about 10 1/8, adding that inch on, so 10 1/8. All right, now my top is going to have an 1.5 inch overhang on each side. So our project should be 12 inches wide. And we're going to add an 1.5 inches on the right side and the left side. So that's 3 inches total. So that's going to be 15 for a grand total. 12 plus 3 inches is 15. From front to back on this project is 12 inches. And we're going to only add an overhang on the front. This is going to allow the project to sit a little closer to the wall. Now you could put an overhang on the back, and that would give you a little room to run cords and stuff behind your nightstand or end table. That's up to you if you want the overhang on the back. It's a personal preference. So we're going to make this 12 plus 1.5 inches is 13.5. So we're going to take our solid lumber and we're going to work on rough cutting our pieces so that we can go joint them and get them to a straight edge. All right, we're over here at our sliding miter saw. We're going to get our boards rough cut for gluing our top and our door together. We're finding the piece of wood that we were using to build our face frame, and what we're going to do is rough cut these. Now if we look at this board, this is the board that I've already cut off of, so I don't need to take another couple inches off the end to check for cracks because it's already been cut. So as long as you orientate the board so that you're cutting off the same end you were previously cutting off of, that should work for you. You shouldn't have to cut any more off. So we're going to add 2 inches onto our size. So I'm going to be doing rough cuts at 17.5 inches long. And we're going to make one cut here. So here's my 2 rough cut pieces for my door. I'm going to set those aside, and now I'm going to rough cut 2 pieces for my top. My top was going to be 15 plus 2 inches. That's 17 for our rough cut. So now we're going to take these boards and go get them jointed so they have a straight edge. Put the rest of your wood back in your work storage area. Put your name on there so there's no mistaking whose it is. So when we talk about rough cutting our pieces, we typically mean add on 2 inches to your finished size to cut at a rough size. Now the reason for that is rather than take a whole 8-foot long board and run it through the machine like the joiner and the table saw, we're coming here first and cutting it to a manageable size that we can feed through the joiner by ourselves or feed through the table saw by ourselves, and that way it's more manageable through all the different machines. So when we talk about rough cutting, we're leaving 2 inches on, not only to make it manageable, but then once it is jointed, it gives us some room to square up the ends. Because our wood comes in with rough factory milled edges here from the lumber mill, and they're not straight. So if I cut this to its finished size right here, there's no guaranteeing that this end is going to be 90 degrees to this surface when I joint this edge. So we want to joint it first and then cut it. So that's why we're rough cutting. 1, to make it more manageable. 2, to leave it longer than the finished size so we can square it up after it's been jointed. So we've got our boards cut here. We need to get a straight edge on each side of these So we're going to take them through our jointer and we're going to get a straight edge on both sides. So we've got all of our boards jointed with a straight edge. Now we need to start laying them out. One thing that I would suggest on boards that are wider than about 8 inches, I use 8 inches as my baseline, and if my board is 8 inches or bigger, I am going to cut this board in half. So I would take this board and cut it down the middle. And the reason for that is if I leave this a big wide board, this board is going to want to warp or cup with the shape of the annual rings. So we can see that this board is kind of got a U shape this way. The board is going to want to cup. And so what we're going to do is cut that in half, and we're going to take this other half and turn it around so that my annual rings would be making a U shape and then a cut arch and then a U shape and an arch, so that we don't have very big radiuses to warp. So this is going to help keep your projects a little more straight. If it does warp, rather than having one big cupping shape, we're going to have a whole bunch of little tiny radiuses or bumps. So again, I use 8 inches as my general rule of thumb. You could do smaller. You could take a 4-inch board and cut it in half and turn the annual rings. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, but the bigger the board, the more likely chance there is that it's going to warp. So we're going to take all of these boards over to our table saw. We're going to cut them in half so we can turn the annual rings. Remember, when you come up for the table saw for the first time, we want to check the blade height, because somebody before you could have been cutting something short or tall, and we want to make sure we set that appropriately. And we should have that set 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the workpiece. So we'll get this dialed in here so that we're just barely above the workpiece. Now we're going to cut these. Now it doesn't matter if they're exactly in half. We're just saying roughly in half. So I'm 8 1/8. I could cut this at 3 15/16 or so to get that right in half, because remember, the kerf or the width of the blade is going to take some material out. So we can't just set this to 4 1/16 because that would not account for the blade thickness. But again, it doesn't have to be perfectly in half. Just get it close. If you want to set this to 4 and have one at 4 and maybe one at 4 1/8, that would be okay as well. So we'll get the saw dialed in here, and then put the guard in place. Small cut. I'm going to need a push stick ready to go, and we will cut these. So I've got my 2 sets of boards now cut into strips, and we can start laying them out to get our pieces set up how we want. Now what we're looking for is some nice grain pattern to kind of blend together. When we glue these together, we want it to have an appearance that it was one piece of board as much as possible. So if we look at this piece of wood here, we have either some really tight grain on this side, the lines are really close together, and this side we have a wide grain where the grains are far apart. And so we're going to be lining them up to try to match it to the board next to it. So if I have my wide grains on this right side, then on this board I would want my wide grain pattern to the left side. And we're trying to match those up so the colors look as good as possible. Now you can see on this board here I have wide grain and narrow grain close together. This around. So now I'm tight grain and tight grain, or narrow grain and narrow grain. And now I'm going to take this piece and turn that around. Now once we have this kind of lined up how we want it, now we need to check the annual rings. And the annual rings can be seen from down here on the side of the board. And what we're looking at are these growth rings of the board. So let's take a closer look in here. All right, so if I'm looking at the edges of my board and I look in here, I can see these grain patterns or the annual rings. Right now, these 2 pieces look like they would fit together as one annual ring. We don't want that. We want them to go every other direction. So we're going to take this board and flip it over. And now you can see my annual ring goes from a U shape to an arch shape. So rather than making one big radius, hopefully if this warps on us, we get small little ripples. So then the next one is going to be opposite as well. And this one looks like it is making a U shape. So we have U, arch, U. Then this last one needs to arch, which it's not. It's going to blend with this one. So we're going to flip it over so that our annual rings are every other direction. Now we're going to go back up to the top side and take a look at our grains and make sure they still line up, since we had to flip over some wood. So I had to flip a couple pieces over. My grain patterns still look pretty good. Now I do have a little bit of a white streak right here in this piece of oak. And what I might do to help eliminate that is I might simply change places of some of these boards. So maybe I'm going to put this one over here, which is going to require me to flip it. And I'm going to flip this one over to take its place. And we're going to see if we can get the grains to look a little bit better. Now I lost that white streak in there, but my wide grain patterns aren't matching quite as well as they were before. We could take one of these over here and replace it with one of these ones. And I'm trying to make sure that as I flip these around that I am keeping the annual rings every other direction. So as we look at this again, I want a U shape. This one should be arching, which it's not. And this one is a U shape, and this one is arching. So this one here in the middle needs to be flipped over. So when I'm changing them around and aligning them, I need to make sure that I'm keeping that grain pattern every other direction. Okay, once you get this laid out where the colors kind of look all right, the grains look okay, then we can go ahead and lay this out so we remember how this goes together, so this time wasn't wasted. And the best or easiest way to do that is to draw a triangle. So if I draw a triangle on this board, this triangle can only fit together one way. If I have one piece out of order, my triangle does not fit together. If I have one piece backwards, my triangle doesn't fit together. So the triangle is the best shape to draw in order to get your pieces realigned. Now because I have 2 boards that I'm going to be gluing up at the same time, or one right after the other, I'm just going to put a number 2 in each triangle, so I know that this is number 2 panel that all these pieces should fit together. Now I've got my orientation correct, I've got my annual rings right, my grain looks okay. Now we're just going to do a final check of our wood joints. We want these wood joints to be nice and tight without any pressure. I should be able to push them up and we should have a nice tight fit. Now as I push these together and take a close look up here, I have a little bit of a gap. So now I'm going to go to the jointer, back to the jointer, and rejoint one of these two or both to get this to be a nice tight fit. When we push these together, we should have a nice tight fit where you don't see any gap in between there. If there's a gap, the clamps would probably pull that tight, but when my clamp comes off, there's going to be pressure trying to pull away. We don't want extra added pressure from this board always trying to pull away because it's tight on one end and not on the other. So we want this to be nice and straight before we join it, or before we glue it together. So we're going to take these little pieces and we're going to joint them. Again, now my pieces are shorter. I'm going to need to use a push block and a push shoe to push these through because my hands would be below the fence, and that's going to be a safety issue. So we want to use push block and push shoe to keep our hands a safe distance away. So now that I've got my joints to fit how I want, now what we're going to do is just verify that this is big enough. We know the rough cut is long enough. We did that over on the sliding table or sliding miter saw. Now when I glue these together, because I've jointed them a couple times, I want to make sure that I'm still going to be able to meet my maximum or my needed width, my minimum needed width. And actually it looks like we could probably actually get rid of one of these because my door, this is for the door only needs to be 10 1/8 inches wide when we finish. So we can actually get rid of one of these and use it for something else later on. Because we cut those boards smaller, now we have some extra room. Okay, so I'm going to set this one aside, and now we're going to work on the next one. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did the first time. I'm looking at my grain patterns. Okay, making sure that the tight grains and the wide grains are together, that my grains look like they're kind of matching up. Then I'm going to come down here to the end grain and make sure that my annual rings are going every other direction. And if we take a look here, these two are going the same direction. They're both making an archin shape. So we're going to need to flip one of those two. And then we're going to check it again. So now we have a arch and a U shape and a U shape and a U shape. So now this middle one also needs to be changed. So let's flip that over. And now look at our grains. Now our grain patterns look like they're set up to be every other direction. So that's what we want. Now we're going to verify and just double check our grain pattern since I had to flip some things over. Now there's a couple things I'm not too thrilled about, and that's going to be this lighter color here when the rest of these boards are more pink. This is more tan. And then I've got kind of a dark streak on this one. So again, we can manipulate these. So if I look at these, okay, I've got this one is an arch, so I could actually bring this one down to the end to try to blend those colors more, because then maybe when I cut off my material, this dark color will be cut away. So now let's take a look and make sure our annual rings are still set right. We have a U shape and an arch shape and a U shape and an arch shape. So that looks good. My wide grains and narrow grains are together. That looks good. I still got this white streak over here, not totally thrilled about. We could try to flip that over. So maybe we should take these two and flip one that direction and one that direction and keep our same annual ring patterns. and try to set these grains up so they're a little bit more like in color. When you find something that works for you, that looks good, now it's a natural material, so you're not going to get it 100% perfect. So it's natural, there's going to be some defects, there's going to be some color variations. So when you get it as close as you can, the biggest point or thing is going to be making sure these joints are nice and tight when we're done. So right now as it looks, this one here has a little bit more of a gap than I would like when we're going to glue this together. So we would need to joint these two again to make sure that that joint is nice and tight fit. We're going to make sure that we have a wide enough piece. So from front to back, our project's 12 inches plus an 1.5 inch overhang. We need 13.5 inches. And so we've got 16 right now. That's good. So we have room to joint these a couple of times and get these joints cleaned up. But first thing, I'm going to draw my triangle, because remember, a triangle fits together one way. I'm going to label these as my panel number 1, since the other one was number 2. And now when I put these back together, I go to the glue table, I don't have to spend time reorienting them to the correct way they go. So now I'm going to go ahead and joint these a little bit better and get them cleaned up. All right, so now that we've got these all jointed, a nice tight fit, my annual rings are the right way, my triangle's drawn on there. Now what we're going to do is determine whether or not you want to put biscuit joints in there. So we're going to glue one of these together without biscuit joints and just do regular butt joints. And we're going to do one of these with biscuit joints just to kind of give you an idea of what that might look like. So I'm going to take my door and I'm going to line that back up in the correct orientation with those triangles. And I am going to now put some marks where I want to put biscuit joints. I want to avoid putting a biscuit joint close to the edge because we need to come in and trim this up. Once we glue this, we're going to come in and cut some off the edge of the board. So if we put a biscuit joint right here, we have a chance that we could cut through that biscuit joint. So I'm going to come in 3 or 4 inches and just make a mark on my board where I want to put my biscuit joints. That mark does not need to be anything fancy. I'm just drawing a line across each board. I'm going to come down here to the other end, come in a few inches, and put a mark across the board. If you want, you could do another one in the middle. Whatever meets your needs. Now we need to go to our biscuit joiner and biscuit these. All right, so I've got my biscuit joiner, I've got my boards that I want to put a biscuit in, and I've got my clamps here. And I know today that we're going to be working with a number 10 biscuit, so I pre-checked that. So we're going to take our machine and we're going to verify that we are set up for a number 10 biscuit by using this dial here. I'm on number 10, so that's good. I'm going to make sure that this tongue or plate on the front is at 90 degrees and it's locked into the positive stop there. Now the one thing I know I'm going to have to change is the height. Okay, the height, we're doing some 7/8 or 15/16 board, and that's going to be different than the normal 3/4 that we do, or maybe it's at 15/16 and you're trying to do 3/4. So you always want to check the height and make sure that's correct as well. So if I take my workpiece and line it up, I can also measure it and then set this correspondingly here. So I'm going to move this up to about 7/16. Then I'm going to come to the side with my plate joiner and see where my red indicator line is. So I would say that I've lowered that too much for this board. So we're going to go ahead and make an adjustment some more here. and getting that so we're about center of our board. I went a little high on my last setup. Okay, so as I'm flat on there, we look pretty close to about centered on our board. For our pieces, you could also measure, and again, according to the ruler, I look like I'm about 7/16 of an inch, which is about where I want to be. A little strong, a 7/16 of an inch. So now we're going to clamp our work pieces down and cut them. I've got my workpiece clamped. My machine is set up. Now I am the operator today, so I'm going to check and make sure the cord is in good condition before we use this portable machine. The prongs are all there that need to be, and then we can go ahead, squeeze the trigger, make sure it's not locked in the on position, and then we're going to plug this machine in. All right, now I'm going to take my machine, I'm going to line the center line up on the face here to the line that I created with my pencil. So now I have my biscuit slots cut on this board. Now I'm going to go to the next board. So I'm going to get that clamped down. And as I clamp it, I need to make sure my clamps are far enough away that that plate is not going to hit the front of the claw or the clamp. And I want to make sure my workpiece is hanging off the table so my machine doesn't interfere, the table doesn't interfere with my cuts, or I don't cut the table. Now I'm going to line up to these marks and do the same thing. Wait for that to stop moving before I set it down, and then turn the board around so we can do the other side. And we're gonna come in here and make our plunges again in here. And we should have one more board to do. And for now, I'm going to be done with that machine, so we'll unplug it and put it towards the center of the table so somebody doesn't knock it off. And then now is an excellent time to do a dry fit. We're going to dry fit this together without any glue, with the biscuits in the joint, so we make sure everything is lined up how it should be. So unclamp it and get your biscuits. So I'm going to just slide my biscuits into the slots and slide my two boards together. Okay, that looks like a good fit on the end. I was able to pull that in nice and tight. Biscuits are nice because they're rather forgiving. If you're off just slightly on your pencil mark, the biscuit generally is not affected by that, and it will still fit together in the work, or in your workpiece. So those look pretty good. Now we're ready to glue. We're going to take this panel as well as our other panel over to the glue table, and we'll show you how to get the glue done. All right, we're at our glue table. I've got a couple of my bar clamps here ready to go. I'm going to spread them open and get them ready to use. And make sure my jaws are backed up on the threads there. And I'm gonna line my board up in here so my orientation of my triangle is in the right direction here. Okay. And then I'm gonna get some glue put on these joints. When we glue butt joints together, we tend to put a little bit more glue on than we need, and that's okay because gravity is gonna pull that down and not cause it to like have a major issue. So I would rather on a flat piece like this have you use too much glue than not enough. We want these joints to be nice and strong, and any excess glue is going to push out of the way. Now when I'm gluing together, I'm going to stand these boards up and I'm going to put glue on these boards. Okay, I'm not going to put my biscuits in yet, and I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to come along with my glue bottle and put a good amount of glue on both of these pieces. Okay, and that's probably a little excessive. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my piece and line it up with the one that it goes with. And I'm going to push those together and kind of wiggle them together. So I'm going to push them and kind of wiggle them around, and you'll see some glue start to pop off or poke out. Now I'm going to pull it apart and take a look. I'm looking that I have glue in this entire piece of wood. Now we can see right here I have a dry spot. So this would be a spot that never got any glue and maybe would be weak on us. So now is a time when we can add a little bit more glue to that one spot. And I can do that again by pushing those together and kind of rubbing them and making sure I have glue coverage on the whole board. Okay? If there's a spot that maybe you missed, take your finger, kind of rub glue down there. We want glue on the whole board, or add some more with the bottle. Once that looks good, now I'm going to come in and I'm going to put a little extra glue down in my biscuit slots because I didn't put any in there before. So I'm just going to put a little glue in my biscuit slots. And I'm going to have to stand this board up as well to do that. And now I'm going to take my biscuit and slide it into the slot. And put those together how they should fit. Now I'm going to do the same thing to this one. Take this joint, push it together, make sure I got glue, adequate amount of glue. I've got a really big dry spot right here, so I'm going to add some more glue. We don't have a lot of time. Remember, about 4 to 5 minutes of open joint time before this starts to cure and dry on us. So I'm going to looks good now. I'm going to add some glue into my biscuit slots. And I'm going to stand these two up and get some into this biscuit slot. And slide my biscuits in. And now align everything. There shouldn't be any surprises when we get over here because we dry fitted these biscuits together over at our work table, so we know everything goes together. Now I'm going to start with my clamps. I'm going to stand them upright. I'm going to pull this bar in, and I'm going to be closer to the edge here, so I'm going to move this down so that my clamp is closer to the edge. And then I'm just going to push down and tighten this. As I tighten it, I'm going to tighten the handle and kind of loosen it, so as it clamps together, it can get a good seat on the clamp. Then I'm going to come down here. I'm just going to put a little pressure on this one for now. I'm not going to tighten it real tight because we want to work our way from right to left or from left to right, and we're going to kind of push any excess glue out the end. So I start on one side. Now I'm going to put a clamp on top. We want to clamp bottom, top, every other one. If we put all of the clamps on bottom, when you squeeze hard enough, it's going to lift it up in the middle. So we need to put a clamp on top to keep the forces equal so that it stays nice and flat. So now I'm going to take my bar clamp on top, and I'm going to just raise this up now on here so my clamp was not hitting this bottom of this table. I'm going to tighten that up, and I'm going to take this last one and tighten that up a little bit more secure. Now when we're clamping, it's very important with these bar clamps that my workpiece is nice and tight against the bar. If it's not, as it glues, if one of these had a slight angle, I would be able to see a gap in there. We can look at the bottom side of the board as well to see how that fits along there. Okay, is that nice and tight along the bar or not? Okay, how are your joints? Are your joints nice and flush or pretty even when you're done? If they're not, then you might have to use a clamp to pull one of them up if your board is warped. So the last thing I like to do right before I snug these down and move this aside is take a mallet, and I'm going to hit my joints and make sure everything is down nice and flat on that bottom bar. Okay? Making sure everything sits nice and flat. That way nothing is askew. When I'm done gluing, I'm not going to have one piece on the end flared up or anything like that. When you're all done and your clamps are secure and tight, we don't want to be too tight because we don't want to push all of the glue out of there, but we want to push most of it. Okay, when we're all done, we need to put our name and date on this project. So you put your name, you're going to put the date, 10/28, and we're going to put the time. So right now it's about 2 o'clock. Now when the next person comes up to use these clamps, they know whose it belongs to, when it was glued, and if the clamps can come off yet. We typically want to let things sit at least an hour, preferably overnight if we can, but a minimum of an hour. Okay? A couple other things you might notice is we've got glue that's built up here on the top surface of our project. We do not want to mess with this glue. We want to leave it alone. And you'll see a little later why we want to leave it alone. If we smear it or try to wipe it off now, it's going to make a big smear mess, and we're not going to be able to remove it as easy. If we leave this big bead here, we can come along with our scraper and that should pop off as it gets dry. Okay, so we're going to just leave that alone. Don't scrape the extra glue now. Don't take a rag and wipe it off. Leave it alone. Now that's a different situation because this is a flat board. If you're building a project and you have an inside corner where corners come together, you then maybe want to get that glue off while it's still wet because you can't sand an inside corner very well. Now that we have this piece done, we're going to move it off of the glue table so somebody else can use this. We're going to actually use it next. And we're going to just stand it up and lean it against the stairs over here so it's out of the way. Any glue is going to drip onto the floor over here. This is not a place that I'm usually rubbing my projects on the floor. So if we get a little glue on the floor, it's okay in our glue up area. All right, now we're ready to do our other board. So I'm going to get those pieces set in my clamps. I've got my clamps roughly where I want them on the table. I'm going to line up that triangle that I drew so all my pieces are in the right place on my panel. And now I'm going to stand these up and put glue on all of these pieces. Now I now have biscuits this time, so it's going to be a little bit different process. Not much, but very similar. But it is a little different because those biscuit slots are not there. I'm going to take my glue again and put a good amount on. We're doing flat panels, so this glue is going to drip down onto the floor. Actually, I'm going to put all of these glues on. And now I'm going to take my boards like I did before. I'm going to lay this one down and smear that together. And as I'm rubbing that joint together, I'm looking to make sure I have glue coverage the whole way. There's no dry spots on that joint. That one looked good, so now I'm going to do the next one. That one looks good. There's no dry spots. And now I'm going to take this last one and rub that in there. Lots of glue came out. I'm going to assume there's no dry spots on that one either. Looks pretty good. So now we're going to put our clamps on just like before. We're going to use 3 clamps. We could use more if this panel were bigger. And I'm going to stand my first jaws up here and get this tight on the end of the board. Now I don't have those biscuits to help orientate the line of the project to keep that from shifting around. So as I tighten this, these may shift. And I want my boards to be nice and flat when I'm done. I want to have as little offset as possible in all my boards because I only have 2 inches big, remember? And if I have it offset 1 inch here and 1 inch over here, then that means I'm going to lose some material and I'm not going to have enough with my 2 inches. So when I clamp these tight, I want to make sure all my joints or all my ends are nice and flat. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to kind of tighten and loosen this a couple times and let that grab that and kind of seat it. You can see when I clamped, some of these shifted a little bit. So now I'm going to loosen it up and line those up a little bit better. Okay, that one's shifting on me again. Maybe what I'm going to do is bring this clamp in a little bit so it can't slide around quite so much. And I'm going to keep those nice and even. So when we get that clamp tight, I want that nice and even all the way down. I want my joints to be somewhat flush. I don't want an offset where one is sticking up way higher than the other. I've got this clamp here kind of tight or snug. It's not tight, it's actually pretty loose. But now I'm going to do the top clamp. So I'm going to have to stand these up so my clamp handle doesn't hit the table here. And I'm going to take this clamp on the top. And remember, the reason we're going bottom, top, bottom is because if we do them all on the bottom, it's going to push up in the middle and cause an heavement in the middle. We don't want that, so we're going to put a bar on top to help keep that flat. And I'm going to get that one tightened up and come back and tighten this one up. Okay? Now, I'm not going to mess with any of the glue that's on the surface of the wood. I want to leave that, let it dry kind of as a nice ridge. Then it will pop off really easy. I am going to look at my clamps though and take a look and see, are we down nice and tight everywhere against the clamp? And now if I look under here, there's a slight gap over here where the bar and the wood meet together. So this would benefit us to take this mallet and hit that. If not, what's going to happen is our wood could be straight to this last one, and this last one might have a slight angle on it, which is going to cause us to have to sand a lot more. So if we take our mallet and get this down flat to that bar, it's going to be a flatter project for us. So I'm going to check this other end as well to see how flat we are against the clamps. And again, down here on this end, I can see a slight gap, indicating that that is not sitting nice and flat. Okay, this end also has one, a little gap. So this is where we're going to use our mallet to tap these down flat. So I'm just going to take my mallet, smack those real hard. Make sure everything's nice and locked against those clamps so they are staying nice and flat. Now again, we need to put our name and date on here so somebody knows when this was glued. 10/28 at 2:15 p.m. Okay? So now when someone comes up to use these clamps, they can say, oh, this was just glued today, the same block. I can't take these clamps because they're the project's not dry yet. So we showed you gluing up 2 pieces, one with biscuits, one without. The process is very similar. The biscuits are not required. They do add strength to the board. Most of the things that our projects are going to be doing are not high strength or high stress situations. So most of the time, gluing up without biscuits is fine. But if you want that added strength, you're welcome to put those into your project. When we are gluing our joints up, we do want to avoid having an offset in the wood. So when we glue these together, we really want to avoid we want to try not to have our work pieces have an offset on the bottom and top, because now in order for us to sand this, we're going to be left with a really tiny board or thin board when we're done to make these flush on both sides. So when you're gluing your projects together, we want the joints to be somewhat flush. You might feel a little inconsistency between each one, but you would definitely not want anything noticeable like this offset here. Once you got your two panels set off to the side so other people can use the glue table, please put your glue bottle and mallets back. When you come over and you're ready to start taking clamps off or wondering if the time is right to take them off, one thing we're looking for is the glue and the color of the glue. So this glue is lighter yellow than this piece of material here. This darker yellow color is going to indicate to us that the glue is nice and dry. This lighter yellow color is going to mean that it's still somewhat fresh. And we can touch the glue bead joint here and you can see that it's still liquid underneath that crusted over surface. So I would say this piece is not quite ready to remove from the clamps yet, so we would want to leave that alone. But when we do take our clamps off, we want to put them back in the clamp rack so they are not laying out on the floor, so that the glue table is clean for someone who's coming over to work on the glue table. So we've now taken our pieces out of the clamp. It's been about 24 hours since we clamped them and glued them. So we're taking them out and we're going to start the next process. Now you can see a couple black spots on here. This is a chemical reaction where the glue and the wood and the metal clamp are touching each other and it turns black like that for some reason. That should sand off of your project, not a big deal. You'll notice that these glue ridges that we left on the project are still there. They're nice and heavy lines of glue. So that's going to make it easier when we try to remove them. If we look at the other side, this was the side that was down when we glued it. You can see these bubbles of glue as gravity was pulling them as they were drying. And we need to scrape this glue off. If we take this to one of our machines, whether it's a handheld sander or our wide belt sander, this glue is going to heat up and transfer to our sandpaper belt. So we're going to scrape it off the best we can before we take it to any machinery. So we're going to clamp it down to the table so that it doesn't move around on us. I'm going to take my scraper, just an ordinary paint scraper we're going to use to scrape some glue off. And we're going to hit all these ridges of glue and get them worked down so that it can safely go through our machine. If we leave these ridges of glue, another thing that could happen is if we take it to a cutter like a saw or a router bit, the glue dries super hard. So if the router or saw is coming along cutting the wood and all of a sudden it hits something really hard like a bead of glue, that can damage the carbide teeth on our machines. So we want to remove it for that reason as well, so there's not this big bead of glue for the carbide to hit. So I'm going to take my scraper and I'm just going to scrape up and down the wood and work these beads of glue off. Alright, so we'll notice that most of the glue is gone off here. There's a few spots that maybe got smeared around on us, and now we can't scrape that really well because there's nothing sticking up. So any time that glue gets smeared, it's very difficult to get out of the wood because now it's kind of crusted over the wood grain and it's flat, so it can't be scraped off. There's a little bit over here. There's a little ridge where the two boards are offset. And there's some glue still in this joint, so we'd want to pay attention to that a little bit more and get some more of that off before flipping the board over. Okay, so we got the board flipped over. Now we're going to address the glue on this side. Again, those ridges that we left yesterday when gluing are going to scrape, hopefully, off nice for us so we're not left with a glue mess. Right, if we take a look now, the glue is a lot more cleaned up than it was before. Not any major ridges of glue. There's still a little bit on here, but we're gonna have to do our best to work around that and try to prevent this from transferring to our machines. Again, if you've got a little bit on there, take just a little bit more time and try one more time to get that glue off before moving on. All right, this is our next board. We flipped, got this clamped down so it doesn't move so much on us. We're gonna come in and scrape off the glue.
Again, try to remove as much as possible from that surface, then we can flip it over, and do the same thing.
All right, at this point, we're going to take our pieces over and get them cleaned up on the wide belt sander. All right, we're here at the wide belt sander. We need to measure the thickness of our board to set the machine to the correct size. So I'm going to take my caliper, make sure it's zeroed out, and I'm going to measure my board. Now I'm looking for a joint that maybe has a little bit of an offset, and I'm going to measure that offset. I want the thickest part of the board to be measured so that I am getting the biggest size. So with this board, I would set this to 0.98. About 0.98 is where we're gonna go for this one. Again, if you have a board that's this bad, we would wanna make sure that we definitely measure this widest part when taking your measurement, because we need to set the machine to the widest part, otherwise we could damage the machine by trying to take off too much at once. So if you have a big offset like this, measure your thickest point when setting the machine. So I'm going to turn the machine on, turn the main power on, and push the green main start button. Now my screen comes alive over here. We're going to program it to 0.98. So I'm going to hit program, 0.98, enter, start. The table is going to adjust to the size we entered. Remember, the top number is our entered value. The second number is the machine size. So we don't want to move until that machine size, the actual size, is where we need to be. Now we can get ready to turn the machine on, but before we make all that noise, we're going to talk about feeding our workpiece into the machine. So because I have these glue joints that may still have a little bit of residue of glue on the top surface, it didn't come off when I scraped, we want to feed the workpiece in at a slight angle. This is going to allow us to sand it and get it cleaned up, but what it's not going to do is create a burn mark on the belt or a spot of glue on the belt in the same spot. If I feed it in straight in, then this line is hitting my sanding belt in the same spot the entire time. So that sanding belt is rotating around, hitting that same spot every time. If we go at a slight angle, now as that sanding belt comes, there's only hitting that glue joint in a different spot for a second. It's not hitting the same spot of glue over and over like it would before. So we want to put our piece in the first couple passes at a slight angle, as long as you have enough room. Remember, your minimum length on this machine is 12 inches. Shorter than 12 inches, we can't sand it. So we're going to go ahead, turn the brake off, start the head and the feed rollers. Make sure your board's not going to start rolling away from you. And then we're going to turn the dust system on. bulk of that glue is gone, we can feed them in straight in since there's no more glue on our joints. We do need to sand a little bit more to get rid of this black spot. We're going to sand it in straight with the grain now. Looks like our sides are cleaned up. We're going to go ahead and flip them over and do the same to the other side. We're going to start by feeding them at an angle because of the glue. All right, our pieces are now cleaned up on both sides, and what we're really hoping for is to have these cleaned up and leave them as thick as possible. The thicker we can leave them, they look a little bit better on the project. The thinner we go, the project starts to look a little goofy when you put a top on and it's only got a 3/4 or a 1/2 inch thick top. Plus we need to be careful because one of these two has our biscuits in there. And if we sand too much, we're going to expose our biscuit joints. So we just want to clean them up so they're nice and smooth on both sides, no glue, no defects. Any chips are sanded out of the way. Now when I was up here at the sander, you may have noticed I ran my pieces at an angle several times until most of the glue on the surface was gone. So even though I ran it 2 or 3 times before changing it, to be straight in line, that was okay. Really what we want to do is just make sure that that very last pass you do is in line with the grain to help prevent you getting cross grain on your work pieces or scratches against your grain. Now we tried to put those at an angle to save the belt from getting glue transferred to it all in one spot, and you'll notice that we worked on one side until that one side was all the way cleaned up. And then at that point, we flipped them over and worked on the other side. When we flipped them over, we started doing the angle again because the angle is going to prevent the glue from buildup. We got a new side that could have some glue on it, so we go through at a slight angle the first couple passes. Now, you may have heard the machine sound like it really wasn't sanding much those first couple passes, and it probably wasn't, because when we measured the thickest point. So that thickest point right here on the end of the board was what was getting sanded. So it took a couple passes to get that down. It may have only been sanding that one little glue joint down each pass. So it really wasn't sanding the whole board. You notice when we got closer to the end, it sounded like it was sanding and hitting the workpiece a lot more. Now that we got these sanded to a finish cut or finish size, now we're gonna go over and take these and cut them down to the finish size that we need our pieces to finish at. And we're gonna do that at the sliding table saw. So let's go over there. When you're done sanding your top and your door, you may want to pay attention to the number that you left off on, because as you make your drawer front, you may want your drawer front to be the same thickness as your door. Otherwise, you might have it look a little off if one is thinner than the other. So if we pay attention to that number, that's where we're going to finish the drawer front so that it's at the same thickness as the door. So before you leave the machine and someone else messes with the settings, make sure you write that on your board or put that down somewhere where you can find it later on in your plans. All right, I'm here at the table saw. Before we cut, we want to verify our sizes, not only on the plans, but also measuring the physical opening that we have created of the door and the physical size of the box for the top. And so after verifying those, I've written my sizes on here. I need to finish this board at 15 inches with the grain here. 15 inches, I'm gonna cut across the grain. And this way I'm gonna be at 13 and a half, okay? for this size. So I've got my sizes laid on here, so I know exactly where I need to cut them. Every cut is going to be different because I have, my door is smaller than my top and so forth. Again, I like to start with my longest piece. If I'm going to set this saw to 15 inches and make my cuts, I don't want to forget that I need to go bigger for my door. So I'm going to start with my 15.5 inch piece, because then if I forget to change it, then I still have enough material to cut off the rest of here. So we're going to pull this back and get it ready to go. And we're going to be cutting a little bit off of one side. So this is squaring up the board to the side that we're going to use as our straight edge. So you'll notice that there are a couple offsets in these boards. They're not too bad, so I think we'll be okay, because we have about 2 inches extra on this board to cut off. And so I think we'll be okay. We'll have enough room. What I'm going to do, since I don't know if one of these edges have been jointed, I don't know if one of them is straight or not, I am going to determine that now for the rest of the project by pushing this tight against the fence. As I push my board tight against the fence, I'm looking for a nice tight fit up along the fence. There's a slight gap here in the middle, so maybe I'll flip this board around and try that way. So I don't like the way that one fits. That one's a little worse. It's kind of got an angle the whole way. So I'm going to use this side as my straight edge. It's the straighter of my 2 edges. Now we're going to come in, we're going to cut a little bit off of one side. We're going to flip it over and cut the rest off, and we're going to keep that X against the fence the whole time. So let's get this turned on. Quarter turn the red button, turn the knob forward, turn the main saw on. When it gets to full speed, turn it back. So there's our board all squared up, nice straight edges. Okay, there's no more offsets on the end. That looks good. Now, if you come to a situation where maybe you got a defect here, maybe you got a little chip on the end or a spot that still has some glue, and you want to take the most you can off of here, you can just skim this side with the blade as long as it cuts every piece. So as you're cutting and that blade comes along and it's cutting every piece so it's nice and squared up, it doesn't matter if that's a 1/4 inch or whatever. Then on the other side you could flip it over and take the max amount off, and that might be 1.5 inches then. So you're taking a small amount off one side, taking a bigger amount off the other if you've got a defect. If you don't have a defect you're worried about, you can take it off evenly, roughly about the same off of each side. So let's cut our next one. That's going to be to 15 inches. Got my board ready to go, 15 inches. Again, we measured our sizes and they're written on here. Our offsets are not too big on this one. Nice and straight cuts, so that's fine. Nothing to really worry about on this one as far as making sure I get it all cut off. So I'm going to go ahead and take a little off one side and flip it over. I first need to find the straight edge. So I'm going to again use the fence of the saw and push it up tight and make sure we're tight, nice, and the whole way. Now I do see a little bump right in here and one right in here on this board, and that's going to be because where the clamps were, those jaws really dug in on this board. So maybe we want to see if the other edge is straighter. Okay, now this edge, when I put it here, has a little bit of a rock. So when I push on this side of the board, it moves tight to the fence, and when I'm pushing on this side of the board, I look at the other side, there's a small gap. And if I come over there and push, that board rocks back and forth. That would not be a good edge to use, because when I'm cutting, if it shifts on me, my board's not going to stay in one spot. So I'm going to come back to this side, even though we've got those little bumps on there from where the claw of the jaw of the clamp dug in. I'm going to use that as my straight edge. We'll take a little bit off of that later on. Put a pencil mark on there, and now we're going to cut that. When I put my board up to the fence, I can put this stop over the top, and that's going to allow me to visualize a little bit more how much material I have to cut. So I can see here, my next cut is going to be tight against the outside of this stop. So if I'm looking at this, I can see I got a good amount of material here. I can look over here, and about the edge of this orange block is where we're going to cut. So we've got a good amount off of each side. We can use these visual indicators to help us see how much we're taking off. All right, so we've got that cut to 15 inches. This next side needs to be 13 and a half. 15, 13 and a half, that's pretty square chunk of wood. You can look at this now and see this is a pretty square chunk of wood. So with a piece like this, we can cut this right here on the sliding table saw. We don't have to go over to the miter or to the regular ripping saw. If we try to do something smaller where it's not quite as square, we might have a chance where that will come away from the fence while we're cutting. So we want to do things that are about square or definitely wider than they are long. So I think this top we can cut here, and we're going to take the door over to the saw and cut it over there. So I'm going to set this to 13 inches. So now I've got my stop set at 13 and a half inches. I'm going to make sure there's no sawdust built up along there. Now I don't need to worry about which side I cut off of last, because I'm going to keep this side against the fence and I'm going to flip it just like I did before. So it does my jointed edges first, because we use that to get both of these sides cut. I don't know if you could hear that power loss, but I didn't have the blade turned back. So here's my top all cut to size, 15 inches wide, 13 and a half inches deep. All right, we're over here at the table saw. I'm going to set my top aside. My top is done. I'm going to be working on my door. Now my door is already cut to length to the 15 and a half inches this way. Now we're going to cut it this way to make it to 10 and 1/8. Now if you remember when we were over on the saw, and I had this jointed edge against the, or I had this edge against the fence, there was a couple spots that I could feel where my clamp had dug in a little deeper than I would have liked to. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the X towards the fence for my first cut, and then I'm going to flip the board over and cut it again to get both sides of the board cut to size and nice and even. So to get rid of those to get rid of those clamp marks, I'm going to cut the board twice. I'm going to cut one side, then flip it over. So right now, if I measure, my board's at 11 and about 9/16 wide, and I need to finish at 10 and 1/8. So maybe my next pass is going to be at about 11 inches, and that will give me a little bit off of each side. So I'm going to set the blade height. Remember, the blade should be about 1/8 to 1/4 inch, just barely above. That looks good. And I'm going to set my fence to 11 inches. So I'm going to put my X that I set on my fence over at the other saw against my fence here. I'm going to cut it. I'm going to change the size to the finished size, and then flip the board over and cut the other side. So now here's my door, my slab door, all cut to size. I'm also going to be getting my drawer front ready. Now I've got this little piece left over. My drawer front is going to be 7 inches wide. This is 8. And I'm going to be 10 inches long for my finish cut. But because of my minimum length for my machines, I need to bump this up to 12 inches minimum to have enough to safely run through the machines. So I'm not actually going to cut this to a rough size. It's already small enough that I can easily manage it through the machines. Remember, rough cutting is to get a manageable size to feed through the machines. So this is my drawer front. I'm going to take it to the jointer and get a cleaned up edge. We're going to use the most of this chunk, so I just need one jointed edge for now. So I've got my drawer front. My drawer front has been jointed. I've got that marked. Now I'm going to run it through the sander, and I want to finish at the same thickness that I finished my door and drawer at my top and door at. So I'm going to sand the drawer front so that all 3 of them match, or at least the door and the drawer front match. They should be the same thickness. So I'm going to look at what I had that set at before. So I had that set at 0.872 as my finished size. So now we need to set the machine, but I can't set it right to 872 because that would take too much off. So I'm going to measure this with my caliper zeroed out, and I'm at about 0.8 or 0.93. So I'm going to have a couple passes. I'm going to get this set to 0.93. I'm going to come up here and hit program, 0.93, enter, and start. While that's going, I'm going to turn the machine on and turn the dust system on. So I got my drawer front all sanded up now. You may have noticed when I was sanding, I went to one side and sanded, and then I came back to the original side because there was a little blemish up in the top corner that I was trying to get away, to get gone from sanding. And what I was trying to do is find a side that's going to be adequate for us. Now, it's personal preference if you want knots and things like that in there. There's nothing wrong with the knots. But if you don't want them in there, then you would need to use the other side. If you're going to use this side, then we wanted to take care of that blemish that is mostly taken care of. There's still a white streak in here, but that's part of the wood growth. So now we're going to cut it to size. I have my jointed side that's all cleaned up. That's going to go against the fence. And I'm going to cut this so the drawer front is 1 inch bigger than the opening. That will allow for our 1/2 inch overlay. So my drawer opening is 6 inches. That means my drawer front needs to be 7 inches. So I'm going to set my fence to 7 inches. And we're going to cut it. If you have a drawer that's wider, maybe you have a drawer that's 10 inches or 12 inches, depending on your design, you may need to glue some pieces together, and you're going to follow the steps that we previously laid out for gluing panels together. You're going to cut boards in half. You're going to have your annual rings every other direction and so forth. If your piece of wood is not wide enough to make your drawer front out of one piece, or if your drawer front is greater than about 8 inches, you'd want to do that in multiple pieces. So we decided on this board to cut the width first. And the reason for that is we need to cut this to 7 inches, and this way needs to be to 10 inches. So once I cut this to 10 inches, it is then too small to run through our saws and sander. So we wanted to get this all prepped first. We wanted to cut it with the grain first, because once we cut against the grain, it's going to be too small. So now we're going to go to the sliding table saw and cut. All right, I need to locate my jointed edge, which is here with an X. I now am going to cut off any excess material, and I've got my stop set to 10 inches. So if I put my board up here and I don't want those knots in there, then I could set my extra material right about on the side where those knots are. I can cut off that edge, get rid of that piece, and come back and cut this side and get rid of those knots. So once I set that fence, I can better visualize where my chunk of wood is and what's going to be cut off. So go ahead and get that turned on and cut your pieces. So there's my drawer front all ready to go. Now that we have all 3 of these done, we can take them to the router table and router them. Typically we want the same profile on your door and drawer, and the top could be different, but typically on a project like this, we're going to do the top, the doors, and the drawers with the same profile on the edge of the board. Now that profile is going to be determined by you in which pattern you like best. So we're here at the router table. We're going to set up a router bit so we can router our doors and our top and our drawer front all at the same time. So the profile I have chosen is just a radius, and it's going to be this bit right here. And what I'm going to do first is make sure that that bit spins freely, that that bearing is not seized up so it doesn't burn my material. Then we're going to go ahead and remove this bit out of the machine by dropping the motor out. So once we've got the motor out, then we need to get the bit out of there by loosening the collet. And we're going to put a small wrench on the motor and a big wrench opening on the top side. And we're going to loosen that. If you position these wrenches just right, you should be able to do that one-handed. Loosen that nut so it's finger loose. It's going to get tight again, so I'm going to still need my wrenches. And this time it's going to unlock from the collet. So now I should be able to pull my bit out of there and have it come out. We're going to put this back on the wall so that it doesn't fall and hit the floor or get damaged by sitting over here on the metal and the carbide teeth get chipped or whatever reason might be. We want to put this away so it's being securely taken care of. Okay, so here's my new bit. The first thing I'm going to do is take the collet all the way out and clean those chips out of there. I want to verify there's no chips or debris left in those little channels. So I'm just tapping that out, and then I'm going to start threading it on there, making sure it goes on nice and smooth. I shouldn't need a wrench or anything to get that started. It should go on nice and easy with my fingers. Now I'm going to take my bit and I'm going to push it down into the collet and start getting that snug. Now I don't want my bit to be bottomed out against the collet nut or the shaft of the bit to be down touching the motor. So I'm going to push it all the way down until I get this nut ready to be tightened up, and then I'm going to pull it up about 1/4 inch. That's going to ensure that my bit is not sitting on the nut and that the shaft is not bottomed out inside the machine. So now we've got our bit where we want it. We're going to go ahead and finish tightening that up with our wrenches. We're going to get it secure so this bit doesn't vibrate loose on us during operation. We don't need to tighten it so tight that the next person can't get it undone, but we want it secure so it doesn't come out. Once you're done, you can put your wrenches back on the tool wall, and now we're ready to install the motor into the base. And I like to stand up and look down through this opening when I'm installing this motor. I'm going to take the base of the motor, I'm going to lift it up from the bottom while looking through the hole, and as I look through the hole, I'm trying to locate the 2 pins that need to fit in one of these 2 grooves on each side. So I'm going to get that in place. Lining up that motor with those pins and sliding it up. Okay, I have not locked it because now we need to set the bit height. And I'm going to take a scrap piece of wood, or a piece of wood, doesn't have to be scrap, and I'm going to set that on the table. And what I'm looking for is for the radius of this bit to be just below the workpiece. So let's zoom in and take a look. So the bottom slope of this radius, again, anytime you're touching the bit, make sure the machine is unplugged. The bottom side of this radius, right on the top corner before it goes down, is what I'm looking at. And I'm trying to get my workpiece to be just under that cutter. If I have that line or that corner in my workpiece, it's going to make a line. So I'm just trying to get a nice slight radius. So I'm going to wiggle this up and check it against my board. And as you look and see there, we're just slightly below the board. Okay? If I push down while I'm routering, I actually might just barely clear that little lip on the bottom corner. So I'm happy with this setting. Now I'm going to lock the motor in place with the locking handle down below. You can see my finger in here, and I'm going to tighten that lever up. Now we're going to set the fence. Okay, the fence is going to get us close, and the bearing is setting how far in we're cutting. So if I take my workpiece and I set it up on top of the profile so that my workpiece is only touching the bearing and I'm up above the cutter, I'm trying to get the front of the bearing even with the fence. So when my workpiece is on top of the cutter and touching the bearing, I can bring that fence up and then tighten it into place. Now as I'm holding my piece up here, I got a little bit of rock on there. That's going to allow me to get my workpiece up to the bearing, and then the bearing is ultimately the depth set here that's going to get my correct setting. So I think we're ready to give this a try. We're going to plug it in, hook up the dust system. Remember, when routering, you always want to do the end grains first. And we're going to do our top, our door, and our drawer front all at the same time, one right after the other. So once you've got the bit set up where you want it, you do not need to take a guess whether it's set right. Run a test piece. Don't be afraid to run a test piece to know that it's set right before you cut your good work piece. So take a scrap piece of wood, make sure it's big enough to safely run through the machine, run a test piece and see how it looks. If it needs some adjusting, make an adjustment and run another test piece. There's always plenty of scrap around here left over from your cuts or in the garbage laying around that we can find something to run a test piece. So this piece, again, is just a test piece to show us what our profile is going to look like, to make sure we have it set up right if we want a nice smooth cut. And we don't have to run it twice. It's not our good piece. We're just trying to see if it's set where we want. Make sure there's not a deep line in there. There's a little slight indication of a line on this side, but that's going to be very minimal to sand out. You may want to adjust the blade, that's up to you if you don't want that line cut in your project. So before running these three pieces of material, I want to look at them And the door and the drawer front are going to be right next to each other. So I'm going to want their grain and color pattern to kind of match pretty uniformly. So if I look at this side, I got this dark streak in here. So I think this is going to be my better looking side. I'm going to put that side down when I run it. Okay, this has got a white streak in here. I'm going to put this more uniform color down. And my top here, if I look at it, again, I've got some white streaks in here, and I want this to appear like it's one piece of wood. So this one's got a dark streak. So you're going to have to determine, based on personal preference, if you like that darker streak in there, or if you like these various color tones in this side. Your preference or your choice on this, not a right or a wrong answer. We're going to run them through, and we're going to do this with the push block to keep them down tight to the table. We're going to run the end grains first. So here are our three pieces that we routered. We've chosen to do the round over bit. The round over bit is very easy to clean up when we're done routering. We can take the orbital sander and sand this surface. But you're welcome to choose any profile of router bit that you would like. Now, one thing to do right now is to verify that my door and drawer front are the same size. We do want them to be same size, so as we're looking at the project, one of them is not larger or bigger or offset than the other. And our top is also ready to go. These just need to have some prep work done to them before they get installed. They need to be sanded and things like that before they get installed.